Our next presenter is Amy Scott. She's an associate professor of history and the director of women's and gender studies at Bradley University. She is the co-editor of City Dreams, Country Schemes, Community and Identity in the American West. Amy has authored several essays on post-1945 U.S. urban history and social movements, and co-edits the Urban West series at the University of Nevada Press. Amy currently is revising her first monograph, City Republic of Boulder, Lifestyle Liberalism and the Politics of the Good Life, and is researching a second short book on the history of urban agriculture. Today, Amy will examine the ways in which Alice Robertson both perpetuated and challenged notions of ideal masculinity and femininity in her roles as teacher, missionary, federal bureaucrat, and congresswoman. So, Amy?
Like the other presenters, I want to start by thanking the incredible staff of the Gilcrease Museum and also the staff at the Special Collections McFarland Library, which is where I did a lot of my research as well. Renee was amazing. She pulled out box after box after box because when I first started this project, I thought I was going to be looking at peyote. And so I looked at a lot of stuff on peyote, but then I discovered Alice Robertson, and that is what I'm going to talk to you about. I also just want to say that this is a homecoming for me because I am from Oklahoma. I grew up, I was raised in Creek County and I went to high school at Manford. And so I have family here today, so my worlds are colliding, and it's in a really cool way. And I'm happy to be here talking at a place that has always been special to me, where I came as a child. So talk to you a little bit about Alice Robertson. My research examines the gendered ideologies that shaped the political career and public life of Alice Robertson, Oklahoma's first and only, and the nation's second Congresswoman. Robertson became a media sensation in 1920 when she was elected on the Republican ticket out of Oklahoma's traditionally Democratic 2nd District. The 66-year-old self-described old maid, I hate that term, but it gets used a lot in the documents on Alice Robertson. She arrived in Washington, D.C. and reported for duty as the sole woman to win a congressional race in the first national election after the 19th Amendment had enfranchised all white women with the right to vote, granting them the rights and the duties that accompanied full citizenship. And by the way, 18 other women ran for Congress in that year. Alice Robertson is the only one that won. Since her victory in 1920, Alice Robertson has been portrayed by both contemporary journalists and academic historians as puritanical, anti-suffragist, anti-feminist, and even anti-woman. Almost everyone who has studied Robertson has concluded that her political rhetoric and her conservative positions on gendered political issues cannot be reconciled with her educational accomplishments, her long work history, 49 years of work history, her political ambitions, or her decision to live her entire adult life as an unmarried, economically independent career woman. More recent scholarship on Alice Robertson argues that she must be viewed as a transitional hybrid figure whose identity and political career were shaped by both the Victorian-era cult of the true womanhood ideology that dictated separate spheres of influence for women and men, and that's been talked about already by some of our panelists today, but that she also embraced components of the more modernist new womanhood ideology that emphasized education, independence, and political careers for women. We have to evaluate her words, we have to evaluate her political philosophies that she espoused over a lifetime of developing and articulating her political consciousness. So I hope to push the scholarship in a new direction by re-examining Alice Robertson's seemingly enigmatic political consciousness and gendered identity in light of her formative experiences as a young bureaucrat in the expanding federal Indian Service. As a clerk, a secretary, and a teacher in the Indian Service, Robertson encountered and absorbed free labor ideology, and she practiced an emerging maternalist reform politics, both of which had a profound and lifelong impact on her political consciousness. I also argue that we must understand Robertson's approach to politics in relation to the gendered, anti-statist, conservative reform movements, both conservative maternalism and conservative patriotism, that were developing in the United States during the Progressive Era and that reached their pinnacle in the 1920s and the 1930s. These conservative movements, which represent important gendered political formations, were a response by conservative women who feared the consequences that women's suffrage, progressive reforms, which they saw as, quote, paternalistic, and domestic radicalism might have on the family and therefore on the nation. And this was in the years after World War I. So, who was Alice Robertson? That's a lot of text, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but I just want to talk you through some of her political identities and some of the roles that she played in both public and private life. She was white, she was female, she was a pioneer, she considered herself a pioneer. Her family had been displaced by choice and in solidarity with the Cherokee. She was a native of Indian Territory, subsequently an Okie from Muskogee, Presbyterian, a Union loyalist, a refugee, a Republican. She was university educated. She was single, unattached to a man by marriage, and childless. Her roles in public and private life: she was an educator for both Cherokee and Creek children. She saw herself as an advocate and a friend and a mother. That's important language that you want to hold on to, a mother to Indian girls. She was a federal bureaucrat. She was an entrepreneur and a restaurateur. She was a savant. She organized a salon in Muskogee. And she engaged in nonprofit work or community development, what we might now call a social entrepreneur. She founded the Red Cross, for instance, in Muskogee during World War I. And finally, she was a politician. And most of what's been written about her has been written about her life as a politician. And I'm basically arguing that, yes, that's really important, but we have to sort of push back prior to her running for Congress, which she did when she was 66 years old, right? So she had this really long public life before she ran for Congress. If we really want to understand what was so interesting about her politics and why it held all these contradictions, and really what looks like a contradiction that's frustrated so many historians, like how could she have been anti-suffragist and then run for Congress? Like that just makes no sense to me, right? But it actually does make sense if we take it back in time and we look at how her life reflected some of the gendered political formations of the time period. All right, so I'm going to walk us through through her bio, building a biographical narrative, and just tell you a little bit more about her background, and I'll also be analyzing some of the gendered political dynamics that she was building and was experiencing during that time period as well. So she was born on January the 2nd, 1854, on the Tallahassee Mission in Indian Territory. Like I said, she was the daughter of Presbyterian missionaries to the Creek. Her maternal grandfather was the Reverend Samuel Worcester, whose name you may know. He had migrated to Indian Territory with the Cherokee in 1835 after serving time in prison for violating a Georgia law that forbid whites from living among and teaching the Cherokee. From 1861 to 1866, this is the outbreak of the Civil War, Alice's family is forced to flee Indian Territory because they were seen as Union sympathizers. This refugee status brought new and harder forms of work for Alice. As her family traveled across Confederate lines and made their way between Union camps en route from Indian Territory into Wisconsin, Alice was the one who rose before dawn at the campsites to help build the fire, to start the kettle, to prepare breakfast biscuits for her family of 6. The Robertsons returned to Indian Territory in 1866, and they rebuilt Tallahassee Mission, which had been used by both Union and Confederate troops, and had basically been disassembled during the war effort and it had been used for literally the building was used for other purposes, and so they had to rebuild it. She acted as an interpreter between Creek people and white settlers who were moving into Indian Territory after the Civil War. And her letters, her journals, and her memoirs reveal that in her childhood, gender identities were often blurred for her. Here's a quote that I want to read by her. She said, "There always seemed a specially heavy responsibility on my shoulders, for I must take care of my mother and the babies, and mother was not very strong. Sometimes I thought I was as brave as any 12-year-old boy could possibly be, for one day I chased a big gray wolf away from the house with nothing but a stick, and I often went away down to the old well for a bucket of water all alone in the dark." So at the age of 17, her family sent her back east to New York to go to college at Elmira, and there she majored in civics. She was older than most of her classmates at Elmira, and she commented in her letters home that she really did not have time for the juvenile activities of her classmates. She was too busy, really. She was already thinking about what her career was going to look like, and that's very clear from the letters that she wrote home to her family. During this time period, one of the things that the students at Elmira got to do is they got to travel to Washington, D.C., and they got to visit the nation's capital, meet with important dignitaries, and they also got to see the art that was the public art that was on display in the nation's capital. And some of those experiences and those trips to Washington, D.C. were very formative to her, and she wrote about them in letters home. She said, "I have ever been much interested in the subject of women's work in her various spheres." And that language of spheres is important. We've heard already about how there was a separate spheres doctrine that determined what roles men and women could play in public life. She said, "Wherever I go, I try to see all that I can of what she is doing. At the Capitol, I saw that severely criticized specimen of women's work, Vinnie Ream's statue of Lincoln. It seemed to tell how obstacles may be overcome and prejudice removed by perseverance." One of the things that's really interesting to me about this quote is that she's acknowledging that women could break barriers, but they better get ready for the criticism that's coming, right? And she noticed that as a 17-year-old on her trip to Washington, D.C. So Alice did not finish her degree at Elmira. She went into the Indian service. And basically, this comes out of her willingness to network. Alice is a hustler, and she's extremely good at networking. It's something that she would be good at all her life. While she was in D.C. as a college student at Elmira, she had the opportunity to meet with Pleasant Porter, who was the chief of the Creek Nation. And he introduced her to important people who eventually got her a job in the Indian service. So her first job in 1873, her first paid job, was as a federal bureaucrat, the first woman to serve as a clerk in the Indian office of the Department of the Interior. So the first woman to serve as a clerk. On the job, she taught herself shorthand and typing, and she learned about domestic science and social welfare work. In 1880, she would become the secretary to the superintendent of the Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania, whose name you may know, Richard Henry Pratt. Now, this is a time period when many women were being hired by the Indian service. And this is a chart from Kathleen Cahill's book, Federal Fathers and Federal Mothers. And Cahill writes that in 1869, there were 28 women working in the Indian service of 625 employees. By 1881, women were 15% of the employees. By 1898, women were 42% of employees in the Indian service. So this is during the time period that Alice Robertson is in the Indian service. Now, why should we care so much about that? One of the things that the nation is engaged in during this time period, I'm sure that you're all aware, is a project, the nation is continuing this project of settler colonialism, right? The nation for a really long time has been engaged in taking land from native people and placing it into the hands of white people, right? And that had been done through conquest, that had been done through violence, that had been done through war. But during this time period, after the American Civil War, the nation is increasingly deciding that there has to be a kindler and gentler way to deal with conquered peoples, and that way was assimilation, right? And part of the project of assimilation was allotment, and part of the project of assimilation, of course, was education. And in this new concept that we need to understand, which is maternalism, I guess I have my slides out of order here. Well, that's okay. Women were considered to be very well situated for teaching. And not just because they were good educators, but because they would model particular types of family dynamics to native children, right? And so Alice Robertson serves in the federal bureaucracy during the time period when women are becoming agents of the state, and they are increasingly involved in helping the state to assimilate native people. This is a picture of Carlisle Institute. This is Richard Henry Pratt. And you probably cannot read the print at the bottom of that photograph, but it says, "Father of the movement in getting Indians out from their old life into citizenship." Okay? He's famous for having said, kill the Indian and save the man, right? So he says, the Indian would be far better off financially, physically, and morally if his right to land had never been awarded. It is a curse to him in every aspect. I am sorry that the Indians are not all bootblacks or washermen, as well as women or barbers, hotel waiters, etc. These qualifications would bring them into fellowship with the world. He goes on to say, I would blow the reservations to pieces. I would not give Indians an acre of land. When he strikes bottom, he will get up. Okay? So this is an interesting philosophy, right? The philosophy is the federal government has an obligation to Native people as wards of the state, but in what should that relationship look like? There's going to be some social provisioning, but ideally what the federal government wanted was to create social programs that would lessen the dependency of Native people on the state by teaching them how to be like white people, right? And how would you do that? You teach them to form nuclear families in which women and mothers play a particular role. Alice Robertson was, of course, on the front lines of that with her work in the Indian Service, and she was exposed directly to this ideology, this free labor ideology, from having worked as Captain Pratt's secretary for 2 years. Now, I've talked a lot about gendered political ideologies, so let me just come back to this for a moment. Throughout the nation's history, we like to think that women didn't participate politically, right? That's sort of the way that we think of women's history, that women kind of pop up when there's a movement toward greater rights, greater citizenship rights, but then they kind of go away, they curtsy and leave the stage. But really, if you look at these different gendered political ideologies that existed, many of them were focused around figuring out how women could participate in public life. The first one that existed was Republican motherhood, and that's the basic idea that women had the obligation and also were specially qualified through their innate qualities as women to educate the nation's children and to educate them as Republicans, right? And that's really Republicans with a little r. We're not talking about the Republican Party here, right? We're talking about the governance system known as republicanism. And the cult of true womanhood, we've already talked about that today. Some of our panelists talked about it in the first round of papers. But this concept that there are separate spheres, that there are separate responsibilities that men and women have and separate obligations, and that woman's sphere is really in the home, and that she needs to make the home a sanctified place, that when her husband comes back from this competitive market economy, he comes back into this sanctified place that she is keeping for him and where she is taking care of the children. And she is pious and she is moral and she has all of these skills to do this. Then there's the new womanhood, which is this idea that around the late 19th century was women can do those things, and yes, women have these skills that are innate skills, but women should also be educated. They should also be independent. They should also engage in careers. Out of the cult of true womanhood, and as a response to industrialization, and as a response to urbanization and the social problems that come with that, we get this new gendered political ideology called maternalism. And that's really what I want to focus on today. So what is maternalism? Maternalism is a form of feminism, and it has really 4 basic ideas that scholars have talked about. The first is that you have to elevate motherhood as women's most sacred occupation. The second is that you justify women's presence in public reform as a natural extension of their experience or socialization, right? So you're acknowledging that women are doing work, important work for the family, and that they need to take that work that they're doing in the home and put it out into the world. And that part of their obligation is to act in a motherly manner toward other women who they deemed were in need of social uplift or social rescue. And of course, that included Native women, right? and that upholding this maternal or this domestic role was the most fitting role for a woman, okay? Now, that's an interesting position for Alice Robertson to have taken because she never married and she never had children. But it's important to point out here that you could say this is the most fitting role for women and still not take on that role for yourself, and that is what Alice Robertson did, okay? So she was a maternalist even though she herself was not a mother. Modeling maternalism. All right, so Alice Robertson, she's been a federal bureaucrat. She's worked in the Indian Service. She's worked at Carlisle Institute. She gets really bad news from home in 1882 that her father has died and that the Tallahassee mission has burned to the ground. So she decides to move back home. And she decides to help her destitute mother rebuild the school. In 1885, she took charge of the Minerva boarding school for girls. And this was it started as a business venture that was intended to provide income for her aging mother. But the curriculum emphasized domestic science training and it emphasized home economics. These were, of course, things that Alice Robertson had learned in the Indian Service. That was the model that the Indian Service was using to teach Native children how to join, quote, civilization. So she says, quote, "We have to educate the girls for wives and mothers. We teach them how to make pleasant homes, and we teach the boys how to support their wives." By the way, if you're familiar at all with Alice Robertson, it might be because you know the connection between the Minerva boarding school that she founded and the University of Tulsa. Eventually, Minerva boarding school becomes Kendall College, and Kendall College eventually is moved to Tulsa and becomes the University of Tulsa. All right, so now we know that out of the Indian Service, Alice Robertson has been exposed to some really important ideologies. The first is free labor ideology, which basically says we want to teach Native people to either become farmers or to some way join the market economy so that they can support themselves and they are not dependent on the state. All right, so that is free labor ideology. And the second thing that she's really exposed to in the Indian Service is maternalism. Now, what's interesting about that is that historians have written a lot about maternalism. Usually they are writing about the maternalism that came out of industrial cities in the North and the East, and they're writing about people like Jane Addams and Florence Kelley and women like that, Julia Lathrop, right? But they haven't exactly focused until around 2010 or 2011 when two important books came out by Kathleen Cahill and Margaret Jacobs that pointed out maternalism is really what was driving the work on assimilation. And that is why the Indian Service was hiring so many women. So we have to, in acknowledging that, we have to acknowledge that that is where Alice Robertson really picked up her ideology about not just free labor, but also about maternalism. All right, so in 1891, Alice Robertson, she is still, of course, engaged in Indian education, mostly in the Creek Nation. And she traveled to a national conference called the Lake Mohonk Friends of the Indian Conference. It's for those of you who are familiar with Native American history, you probably recognize that conference. And she was there to give a talk on the education of the 5 tribes. And among the editors, among the writers and the teachers and the government officials who were there in the crowd was Teddy Roosevelt, the future president of the United States. He was at the time working for the United States Civil Service. And he came up to her after her talk to say, "Hey, I really like your approach of," she was basically talking about free labor ideology, she was basically talking about maternalism, and he said, I like what you have to say, and that was the origins of a life. They were friends until he died. He died before she did. So Alice Robertson in 1898, she helps Teddy Roosevelt recruit volunteers for the Rough Riders during the Spanish-American War. And this is an important moment for her because she's crossing gender barriers. She is demonstrating patriotism, even hawkishness, one might say, and not just engaging in patriotism by caring for wounded soldiers, but she is engaging in patriotism by mustering soldiers for the cause, right? And so she already is demonstrating a sort of conservative patriotism at this point in her life, as early as 1898. So in 1900, she decides that she wants to apply to be the supervisor of Creek schools for the federal government, and Teddy Roosevelt wrote her a letter of recommendation, and she got the job, basically, right? She first wrote to him to ask for the letter of recommendation. She said, I want that appointment because I believe that I am better fitted by training and experience to perform its duties than anyone else. I know I am capable and competent. And he did write her a letter, but she also wrote to the president asking for the job. She said, the only objection which can logically be raised, my being a woman, can surely be met, right? So she's not denying that she's a woman. She's actually going to use the fact that she is a woman to her advantage to be able to say, look at the ways in which I've engaged in educating Native people from this place of this domestic sphere, from this place of maternalism, right? The other thing that's really important to notice about how these relationships are developing is that Alice Robertson is becoming a party insider, okay? When women applied to the Indian service, a lot of times they got their jobs through patronage, and the separate spheres cult of true womanhood ideology often doesn't let us recognize that because that ideology, it indicated that women were not political, right? That women could not be corrupted by politics. But what we have to notice is that when these women applied for jobs in the Indian service, how did they get the jobs? They got the jobs through political patronage. And so Alice Robertson's connection to the Republican Party is going to be really important. And I want you to hold on to that idea. Because when she gets into Congress, she is going to take this position of, I don't want to deal with women's clubs, and I don't think women should organize outside of political parties. Just work through your party. Well, she wasn't saying that because she was anti-feminist. She was saying it because she was a party person, right? She was loyal to the Republican Party. Why? Because every job that she got through political patronage, and that's a really important thing that I think has been overlooked in the scholarship on Alice Robertson. Okay. So she got that job, right? And then President Roosevelt appointed Alice to the position of postmaster of Muskogee in December 1904. So far as I know, she was the first woman to be appointed to a post office that was considered to be a first-tier post office. And this was an incredibly important job for Alice. She would hold that job until 1913. And it was the most steady income that she ever had in her life, right? And especially since the time that her father had died. She was the highest paid woman in the area after she received that appointment. She earned a salary of $3,400 per year. And that allowed her to build Sewokla. Sewokla, I thought I had an image of Sewokla. Okay. Somewhere I have an image, you will eventually see an image of Sewokla. Sewokla was 55 acres it was on 55 acres of land that she bought on historic Agency Hill, which is now the Honor Heights neighborhood of Muskogee. It's 3 miles west of the city. And she named the farm Sewokla. Everything that I have read indicates that it means meeting place. It was a spacious house that she built out of native rock and shake shingles. It was surrounded by native oaks and blackjack trees, and it overlooked the Arkansas River Valley and the site of the old mission where Alice had been born. So from 1913 to 1920, she does not take any political appointments. She took on instead the role of entrepreneur and patriot. So finally, Alice has this home. She has an income. She has a sense of security, and she has a plan for the future. Because she really did live for most of her life on the brink of poverty, and she would die basically penniless. She wrote to her sister in 1913, "I have decided to make the farm my bank." Okay, well, I thought I had a slide in there. She became self-sufficient as a farmer. She started a restaurant, and she drilled her own gas well to supply Sewokla with fuel. She also opened a cafeteria in downtown Muskogee, and she sold the food that she produced on her farm. So the cafeteria actually started as a club for working girls. It had a reading room, it had lockers, it had showers, a restroom, and basically women could buy a membership card and come to Sewokla and use the facilities when they needed to. They just paid a fee and they got the card and they could access Sewokla's services. And word spread about her cooking. She was a good cook. People enjoyed eating at this restaurant. And eventually she was convinced to open the restaurant to everyone in the community, and she ended up feeding hundreds of people every week. Sewokla Farm was large. It had 1,000 chickens. It had several vegetable gardens, and she herself supervised the personnel. She set their wages. She ordered their supplies. And if you look through her collections at the University of Tulsa Special Collections in McFarland Library, you will find so many ledgers of her just recording what was ordered for the farm, where she got it from, how much it cost, what was served at the restaurant that day, and she kept meticulous records. So by the time she was 50 years old, she had become one of Muskogee's most successful business people. Okay. So I want to stop here and backtrack a little bit because I missed this part about Oklahoma statehood, and that's important for understanding some of the arguments that went on at the state constitutional convention about whether or not women should get the right to vote are important for understanding why Alice Robertson considered herself to be they're not necessarily important for why she considered herself to be an anti-suffragist, but they're important in helping us understand the context around the arguments of anti-suffrage. So a lot of women who were anti-suffragists, and there were many, right, and they had organized nationally. The most important organization was in New York, but they organized chapters in most states. And most of the women who considered themselves anti-suffragist would basically acknowledge that if we have the right to vote, if we are equal to men, then men will no longer be obligated to care for their families. And what will happen then, right? So, and they also said, we've gained an enormous amount, not an enormous amount, but we've gained some political power through this ideology of separate spheres and the cult of the true womanhood. What will happen if we have the right to vote? Will we lose that political power? How will we access political power? And so a lot of anti-suffragists took that perspective. Now, when you look at the debate that went on in Oklahoma, because Oklahoma had the opportunity to enfranchise women when Oklahoma became a state, they chose not to. And in fact, women in Oklahoma got the right to vote in 1918, so this is, in fact, an important centennial year for that. But if you look at the arguments that went on, they were, I think, a little less nuanced than some of the arguments that women anti-suffragists were making. So let's click through some of these arguments. Okay. Upon her taking a little slip of paper and dropping it through a slot in a box, hang all the dire calamities of civilization. Heaven and hell shall change places. Sex is destroyed. Femininity becomes, I have a typo, sorry. Femininity becomes masculinity. Women will no longer desire to be loved, nor man to love her. Like, literally, the world is turned upside down if women get to vote, all right? Primarily, the woman is by nature designed for motherhood. Her very life must be given up to that great natural first duty of woman. So we do see the maternalist argument as well there. But this is more, this kind of argument by Charles Haskell, whose name you may recognize. He's an important person in Oklahoma history. If women could vote, quote, you would come home to find a home once cheery, where the warm supper was on the table and the wife anxious for your return, replaced by a candidate for county commissioner whose campaign has taken so much of her time that really it hadn't occurred to her that supper was part of everyday life. Well, that seems like a fairly self-interested comment, doesn't it? But it also says it's a slippery slope. If women get the right to vote, they're also going to be political candidates. They're also going to be in political powers of positions of power, and this could be very problematic. So he says, go back home to your boys and continue to rock the cradle and rule the world, but not from a position of political power, right? This is a quote by Lily Haskell, who was Charles Haskell's wife. She said, women vote for love or hate. They have got to do it in self-defense. What do you make of that quote? Women vote for love or hate. Women are too emotional, right? They're too emotional. They can't make rational political decisions. And this one by another name you may recognize, William Alfalfa Murray. If you adopt this provision, it will mean giving the balance of power over to the Negro vote. So effectively, the concern in Oklahoma by some people, especially Democrats, was that if white women were allowed to vote, so would black women be allowed to vote. And one thing that Democrats in Oklahoma knew was that women were already allowed to vote in school board education elections, right? And there was clear evidence that black women voted in much higher percentages in those elections than white women did. So he was concerned about that. This is a quote by another delegate, Delegate Henshaw. He said, women's suffrage will eventually mean socialism. And socialism means the destruction of the home and the destruction of marriage relations and marriage vows and the adoption of the horrible doctrine of free love. Right, so, right, oh my goodness. So we're all laughing, but was socialism actually a viable political position in Oklahoma during this time period? Yes, right? So possibly in some places up to 20% of the electorate identified as or were voting for socialist candidates. So there was actually a concern that, and socialists, by the way, were pro-suffrage. Why? To get more people to vote for their candidates, right? And also that they took different positions about the role of work in connection to the capitalist state, as we all know. Okay, so those are some of the positions that were being put out there when Oklahoma does not enfranchise women to vote when at the first state constitutional convention. Okay, so Alice Robertson then is an entrepreneur, and she is going to use her platform as an entrepreneur and her cafeteria, the actual space of her cafeteria, to accomplish more public service within a traditionally female role, cooking for people, specifically troops. Okay, so she founded the Muskogee chapter of the American Red Cross, and as troops began moving through Muskogee, on their way to Mexico originally, she began greeting the troops and handing out supplies to soldiers. In 1916, 15,000 troops passed through town, and she met them with postcards, sandwiches, cakes, and milk from her farm. She loaded up her Ford with goodies from her farm and her cafeteria, cookies and pies, chewing gum, hot coffee, and she met every train that carried a soldier. And she was reported to have sat up all night waiting for those trains to arrive, sitting on the platform. I don't know if that's actually true or not, but people reported that in the local newspapers. Eventually, the railroad company decided, if she's this serious about this, let's just give her an old passenger car and let's set it off on a sidetrack, and we will create a Red Cross canteen. We'll help her create a Red Cross canteen. So at her cafe, not only does she run that canteen, but she also allowed no soldier and no member of a soldier's family to pay for a meal at her cafeteria. And she served over 5,000 troops in 1917 and 1918. Now, this is not a good business plan, right? You cannot make money serving 5,000 people for free in 2 years' time. But what she did with her charitable work with soldiers is she placed herself in a motherly role, and she also practiced conservatism. Two important concepts for this emerging gendered political formation that will eventually be called conservative maternalism, okay, or conservative patriotism. So her patriotic activities during the war were not good for business, and they nearly bankrupted her. But it also won her the respect of her neighbors, and she was a Republican in a Democratic district. So she is now well positioned to run for political office in 1920. So in September 1920, a month after the adoption of women's suffrage to the 19th Amendment, Oklahoma Republican leaders came to Alice Robertson and asked her to run for office, and they hoped to capitalize on her popularity as a businesswoman in Muskogee. She decided that she would run, and her decision to do so shocked a lot of people because they connected her to her anti-suffrage politics. She had, in fact, served as the vice president of a state anti-suffrage organization. So how did she explain her decision to run? Oh, there's the image of the gas well in Sewokla. Finally, it's out of place. Okay. Here's what her position had been before she decided to run, right? I do not ever want to see a woman political candidate. I do not want the right to march around handing out cigars. Well, it's a very gendered statement about the roles of men and the masculine nature of politics. But she decided, like I said, she's a practical person. When a door opens, she walked through it, right? And so she began to reframe this as, well, now that we have the civic responsibility, I will take up the burden because I have done men's work. And women need a person who has another woman who has done this kind of work to protect their interests in Congress. So again, we get a sense of maternalism there, this sense that women are there to protect. I've always done a man's work, carried a man's burden, and have had to pay the bills. I believe that's why I never wanted to see suffrage for women, but implicit in that is, now that we have it, I'm going to take advantage of this. She also, let me back up there and talk just a little bit about her campaign. Her campaign is very interesting. She becomes known as the kitchen candidate, okay, because neither of the daily newspapers in Muskogee supported her campaign. They were both run by Democrats. And so she did not, she tried to advertise, she did try to pay for her political advertisements in those newspapers, but she was usually foiled, and her advertisements were either run in incomplete forms or they just weren't run at all. And so consequently, she started placing campaign messages in the classified section of the local newspapers right alongside her advertisements for her cafeteria. So sometimes you would see the menu, and sometimes you would see right next to the menu a statement about her political campaign. And so these advertisements blended her public and private spheres. She's a woman running a kitchen, serving people, and she's also running for political office. But she's running in a way that constantly reminded readers of home and reminded readers of family values. Sometimes she would criticize her opponent, who is W.W. Hastings, and by the way, he won the previous 2 elections before her and the next 6 after her, which is interesting, right? So that tells you about the fact that she was part of the Harding landslide more than anything else. But sometimes she would criticize him, but more often than not, she placed menus and helpful hints and occasional moral advice next to her political views. She also wanted to let people know that she was the right kind of woman for the job. She wanted to let voters in Muskogee know that she was not a man-hater. She was not an Amazon, and that's language that she would use. She said, Hetty Green was the only woman I've known who never asked a man for help, and she was always a bit of a freak. How should we read that? That's a really fascinating quote. The way that I read that is that Hetty Green was a freak of nature, and likely a lesbian, right? So Alice Robertson wanted to make sure everyone knew that while she was unattached and childless, she still had a mother's heart, and that's a quote, right? She talked a lot about her mother's heart, and again, relied on maternalist politics to explain her political perspective, and definitely to assure people that she was not a man-hater, and unlike Hetty, she was not a freak. So here's an example of what she would put in her Sewokla ads, the kitchen candidate. There are already more lawyers and bankers in Congress than are needed. The farmers need a farmer. I am a farmer. The women need a farmer to look after their new responsibilities. The soldier boy needs a friend. I promise few speeches, but faithful work. You can judge my promise by my past performance. All right. So she won, as you know, and she played on populist feelings that were strong in Oklahoma in 1920. She framed herself as the people's candidate. She said, I'm not part of the democratic structure. I'm not tainted by political corruption. I'm a Christian, I'm an American, and I'm a Republican. That was basically her main campaign slogan. I cannot be bought, I cannot be sold, I cannot be intimidated. So she gets to Washington, and immediately she gets the attention of the national press. And here's a quote from the national press. Picture a silver-haired woman, very clear complexion, bright-eyed and gentle voices, of a figure taller than the average and somewhat stout, the shoulders sagging a trifle, under the weight of her 66 years, indifferent to fashion's dictates, but comfortable and completely clad from throat to insteps, going about her duties with a tread suggestive of tired feet in old-fashioned prunella garters. So this is, first of all, this is commentary on her appearance, right? Not surprising that we would see that for a woman politician. But it also suggests that she's too old, and she's too old school, really, and that really she is not the kind of modern woman that one would have expected to have won a congressional election in the post-19th Amendment era. And she does not win any friends in Congress with politically active women. She immediately basically starts attacking the groups that she considered to be the women's lobby, who were also maternalist, right, but who were advocating for a larger federal role in social work. And she said, organizing as women and outside of parties is class selfishness. I therefore oppose all organizations of women as women voters. Instead of American citizens, such organizations tending to the most dangerous class of legislation, that of sex. Fascinating, the most dangerous class of legislation. Well, this makes sense because Alice Robertson's entire political career has been about maternalism, right? And she wants to stand in that power that she had achieved her power by standing in maternalist politics that said women's most important role is as mothers. And consequently, we don't need the federal government involved in the family. Right? And this is where her maternalism diverges from the maternalism of people like Jane Addams and Florence Kelley. She begins to shift to say, we want to keep the federal government out of the family. And I think that I'm running out of time here, so I'm going to have to wrap it up. But I also want to say that one thing that I want to look further into is what role her experience with Carlisle Institute played in prompting her to think about what role the federal government should have in families. She does go on the record when she gets back to Oklahoma in saying that we should not send our children off to boarding schools. They should stay in the community. And then if there are students who want to apply for opportunities at those boarding schools, they should be permitted to do so. But she takes that position that the home should not be infringed on from these outside external forces, and in particular, the federal government. So I guess by way of concluding, I just want to tell you about a couple of other things that, I know, I wrote a lot here, didn't I? I hope that at some point this will be a publishable paper. There are questions that remain that I think we all need to think about. What role did Robertson's understanding of racial hierarchies play in her anti-suffrage position? I did mention that there were Democrats and there were also Republicans who were motivated to oppose suffrage for women because they believed that black women would be more politically engaged than white women would be, and that would empower black people in the state. And I wonder to what degree her anti-suffrage position was influenced by white supremacy. I did not find anything in the documents that I looked at, but I think it needs to be investigated further. I'm also interested in thinking more about her use of gendered language. In a Chamber of Commerce speech, a Tulsa Chamber of Commerce speech that she gave when she was a congresswoman, she said to the audience, "I prefer to be called congressman or a representative, but do not call me congresswoman." And I find that fascinating. Was she challenging gendered language because she was not challenging the fact that elected offices had historically been the domain of men, and she thought that that trend was likely to continue? Did she just see herself as an exception? Why did she want to be called a congressman? I'm fascinated by that. Also, this language of old maid. That's a difficult label to wear, right? When the political power that one has claimed is rooted in maternalism. And so I find her references to herself as an old maid fascinating. Old maids were supposed to disappear, right? They were not supposed to run for Congress, and yet she did. And she claimed the label. She refused to disappear. So I'm interested in this question of how do you find power in social judgments that have historically created limitations on women's capacity, even their desire to participate in public life? Is this an example of adopting the language of one's oppressors? I don't know. But definitely she took ownership of a diminutive stereotype, and in doing so, I think she took away its power to demean. I also think that, I just want to close by saying Alice Robertson's story is important because it's obviously an important example of someone stepping out of their lane, right? She stepped out of her lane all the time. And though she continued to defend a contained sphere for most women, not herself, but most women, she never underestimated women's potential or limited her own participation in the world around her. And she had to take a lot of risk to step out of her lane in the way that she did. It took incredible fortitude and incredible strength. I think that one of the reasons that Alice Robertson has been dismissed by a lot of historians, or maybe just possibly not understood, is that we judge her by some of our contemporary feminist ways of thinking about the world. It's really hard for us to get our heads around the fact that she could have opposed the vote and then run for office. But that isn't fair to judge her in that way. And judging her in that way overlooks a lot of things. It overlooks, most importantly, the presence of a conservative anti-feminism and different understandings of women's political culture and how women participate in American politics. And by the way, that conservative, anti-feminist conservative approach is still with us today, and I think that makes Alice Robertson's career even more interesting. Thank you.